Hello lovely people, my name's Stephen Colber. I'll be speaking to you today about accessibility for students and partly somewhat for teachers as well. So I work at Brunswick Secondary College, a little bit at Victoria University and occasionally at the University of Melbourne. And you can contact me in these various places, and until they name a new group of top 50 teachers, I'm going to keep that up there until later this year. So I obviously recognise that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and recognise elders past, present and emerging. Just before we jump in, obviously I'll be talking about inclusion and accessibility, but I am myself primarily a high school teacher. So, if I misspeak, that's, around disability or use the wrong nomenclature. I know that's a changing space that I'm not necessarily as much across as I was when I was studying for my special ed qualifications. So keep that in mind and feel free to come let me know if I make an error as I go. So I think the first thing and the most important thing perhaps to talk about in terms of accessibility is our teaching. So for me personally, the more I reflect on teaching itself, I realize it's not necessarily a steady progress line. It's not always a straight line, but rather it's troughs and sort of leaps, quantum leaps, in fact. So for me personally, this involved, the first time I got a clicker, I realized, wow, now I'm not chained to the front of the room. First time I got a wireless mouse, I realized, hey, I can stand at the back of the room and run a Kahoot. I can present, I can draw, I can do all sorts of things from the back of the room. And so for me, my progress in teaching dramatically shifted after that. A whole range of options became available. These weren't always technological, mind you, a mixture of behavioral belief systems, theories of practice, all sorts of different things changed my practice in this way. But since we're talking about accessibility, I think it's important to foreground that for us as teachers, our teaching can have a really big impact on students. So those small examples might not make much of a difference, but once we got touch devices, for example, regardless of students' typing ability, things became more possible. And then, of course, when I started to use read aloud software myself personally and with my students, that of course was another big breakthrough. So I've already covered that, but just keep in mind these are the kind of things that might be a small change, and these are probably things far in your past now as we're at EduTECH, but these kind of things make a big progress in your teaching, which of course helps your students. That's the idea. That's what we're all here for, perhaps. So touch, obviously, for me was massive. Being able to actually write and annotate students' work and being able to annotate live in front of a class of students, novels, texts, articles was really important. For me, and this is going to look very egotistical to have pictures of me while you hear me talk, but the first instructional videos I made completely revolutionized my teaching. Made me realize, okay, some of this content I may never actually need to directly say out loud to a class again because it's available, it's online. It's the kind of stuff that they can access at home, they can access on the bus, on the way in, on the way out, and even during remote teaching, obviously, it was a great support then as well. So flipped learning is perhaps not the most popular approach anymore, but again, for me, this was a massive leap in my teaching, realizing, okay, the primary change for me was, okay, some of my content is now video. What do we do with the rest of the time? How do we make the class different? How do we listen to the students? How do we give them voice and empower them and find ways to make them actually contribute to the learning rather than a one-directional, monodirectional monologue from me imparting knowledge onto my students? Similarly, the change when I went from focusing on doing good teaching, being interesting, being engaging, coming out with crazy off-the-wall activities, to actually focusing on the learning and getting students to really rehash and engage with the information that they've learnt more than once, so that they actually, dare I say it, put it in their memory for good. And of course, retrieval practice is a whole range of strategies that I'm still continuing to strive and improve into my practice as ways to make the actual learning a part of the practice rather than just focusing on me as a teacher. Gamification was mixed results. I did it for an entire year, and we had teams and everything was a game. There was a grand narrative. I did all those sort of things. For the group I trialed it with, it was sort of mixed results, but definitely that changed the way I taught forevermore, because it's kind of a range of strategies, skills and beliefs that kind of stick with me even now in the way that I engage with my students. my first ever screen recording, and obviously your software might be different. But I think we can all remember, instead of having to sit, and do the, yep, drag that, click that, yep, all right, okay, and wait, for the paint to dry almost, make a screen recording and just people can see what it is you're doing. Similarly, and this is my last one, but peer assessment, getting the students engaged in the assessment process rather than it just being a massive pile on my desk. As an English teacher, that's a real thing. So I'm just trying to raise not put aside the focus of direct teaching and the way that we teach and how our belief system impacts on the way that we teach. So, for you, your quantum leaps could be theoretical understanding, strategies. Could be when you read an academic article and something clicked. When you read a book, you heard a podcast, something that you did that really changed your practice and your beliefs. And obviously, I'll leave those for you to consider for yourself. And then we're going to be shifting to universal design for learning for teachers. Now, this isn't really something I've heard done that often. It's always something that we talk about in forefront for students. They should be able to access their learning in 100 different ways, but we don't really then apply that same skill set to teachers. So it's my belief, if there's a technology that works well, it should be able to work for both teachers and students. So using teaching and teacher tools to empower students, but also to empower the teachers, to give us some of that time back that is such a precious resource for us. And, obviously accessibility is sort of a hot topic, but it's something regardless of disability or not, the more accessible we can make our classes, our digital learning spaces, and everything in between, the more beneficial things will be for all participants in that process. So I'm relatively tech neutral, so I'll be taking you through a range of different options that'll sort of chop and change across the spectrum. If you're, from a Microsoft school or a Google school or an Apple school or some other type of school, that I'm not familiar with, you might, have to use these a little bit flexibly like I do. But for us as a school, the game changer was sort of assistive technologies. Dragon Speak, sort of mixed results, but basically for communicative, outwards communication, getting students to do voice to text is something that we're still working on improving, and in my practice especially as well, and in me as a teacher using it as well. But for receptive, ClaroRead has been a game changer. And of course, there's, off the shelf, there's free, there's a whole range of different options you can consider. But for me, that's my tip. Pen readers, these work really well for me in my experience with EAL students. People have a general fluency in the English language, and they're just, bit unclear on certain words. But if you do entire texts for a high school, it just doesn't necessarily work. So you can see on the left text, and on the right you can see sort of the pen reader comparison, and you can get, I think, a pretty clear insight into that. It's what you might think of is as a neurotypical person without dyslexia or anything like that, that it's just a easy fix up. But of course, if you're relying on it fully for your comprehension, then some cracks start to show. So it's all about making your learning I guess we have to sort of think about online learning as its own space, as its own entity, and so some of this stuff will sort of move into that space. So we've talked a little bit about the teaching and how your quantum leaps in improvements can support your students, but also now we're shifting a little bit into the digital space. So this might be familiar to some of you already, but the web content accessibility guidelines, and there's going to be a whole bunch of QR codes for videos and things that you can watch as we flick through if you're quick with your phone. But I'll take you through the broad tenets. So perceivable, you sort of want it to be able to be screen read, captions, those sort of things. You want those to be available, and you want the things that you're doing to be perceivable. So you want it to be operable, which basically means you should be able to work it with a keyboard, ideally. And I don't know when the last time it was that you tried to tab through a website or similar. But operability in that case is quite important if you're not, using a mouse or touch, or you're using some sort of an alternate device to access this content. Understandable, it's kind of, basically the tenet is that the more cognitive load we put on our students by making complicated slides, the harder it is for them to understand. Keeping it relatively simple and streamlined is the idea. And so you can see, this website is lots of tabs, lots of little breakaway things. If you're navigating that through an alternate device, or you're getting it read aloud to you, you can just imagine how much noise and bizarre stuff is actually being produced for you in that content. And then robust, and I'm sure we've all had this experience of kind of jumping across devices, and then things go a bit skew-whiff and they don't look quite right. So those are the 4 principles of the WCAG 2.1 model, which might be good for me. And this is something I think that if I had the time and the money, that I'd really invest in looking into more information about how our online spaces look, applying these 4 principles to those spaces. So sort of bridging the teaching world and the online digital space, my use of instructional video, again, was probably the game changer in my teaching practice, and kind of how I found what I consider my pedagogical gift, my way of communicating things that not necessarily all teachers do. And as part of that process, hearing myself, editing myself, picking up a whole range of issues in my presentation communication and all sorts of other things. Instructional video has granted me those sort of insights. There's probably not that many people with a reference list or taking photos of this one necessarily, but this is kind of the research basis that I use, that I believe backs up the use of instructional video. So whether you're on board flipped learning or not, there's video modeling in special ed, assistive technology, universal design for learning, CLT, MCLT. All of these things in my reading of the research seem to suggest that there is some benefit in a video as opposed to a worksheet, a document, and a plain PowerPoint, those kind of things. So this is a little bit of an insight into what we've set up. As we're a government school, so we don't necessarily have money falling out of our ears, but this is the kind of space that we set up for our instructional design. So we've got a swivel, a whole bunch of tripods, microphones, podcasting equipment, a green screen that we set up relatively cheaply without any especially flash technology to back it up. It's basically just a cloth. And so you can see these are the kind of videos, instructional videos, that we're able to produce to give you a bit of an insight into kind of different ways that you can be using it, different subject areas, of course. Obviously, me as an English teacher, we tend to focus on skills. And if you really wanted, you could green screen Independence Day into your background. So again, each of these are sort of different spaces. We've got the light board down the back. Podcasting, you can of course use the swivel for a similar purpose, for classroom observations, those sort of things. And just to have sort of clean black backdrops. If we think of many spaces that we set up, or many spaces that we're asked to do a video meeting or record an online video, there's often a lot of noise, a lot of people about, to be completely honest. And this is kind of doesn't look necessarily great from that angle, but there's a light board which is popular amongst our maths and science teachers, just as an alternate way to deliver the content to our students. If you're interested in any of this, of course, the Teaching Online Masterclass is a good way to look into that. It's free, it's openly available, sort of a ClickView Adobe collaboration, and a whole bunch of other people as well. Or you can watch this course that I created for ClickView on ClickView. It's also on YouTube as well, creating instructional video, my kind of justification for why it works, how to do it well, and how to kind of include it into your teaching, which is something I think is very important. Similarly, there's some online teaching interactivity that's mostly a text-based course, but there's some really good content in there from Monash University that again is free to explore. So some of these tools and other tools that I'm going to bring to you can be used for teacher productivity. And I think this is where you get your bang for your buck, because it's always, differentiation and inclusion and accessibility. These are things that we all see as important, but it's also one of those things we think, it's just another one of many other requirements that we sort of need. But this is kind of, for me, where you get the value add of also improving your own productivity and being able to do things a little bit quicker and cleaner. So if you have an iPhone, first thing I'd be doing is digging into the settings, doing a bit of a search for speak screen and looking for this iPhone feature. You do a double pinch from the top and you can pretty much read aloud anything on your screen. If you're on the go, as we always tend to be, chucking your AirPod in, and then there you go, you're listening to whatever is in front of you. Then, if you find that useful, I would then upgrade to ClaroRead Pro, which is, a little bit of a higher standard. You can do, some pretty fancy stuff where you give it a PDF and it'll sort of convert that into text, even if it's not, and all those sort of things, customize voices and all, the nice things that you need. So of course we use that as a school, or as an off-the-shelf product, but we then would be aiming to transition our students into using ClaroRead Pro on their phones or their personal devices, as it's a lot cheaper, and it's the kind of thing that they could be doing in their adult life rather than simply on their school laptops. So for me, get onto BorrowBox, get Word, Chrome, Edge, whatever it is, to read aloud PDF documents. For marking, I can't remember the last time that I actually read a Word document of students' work. I tend to prefer to get it read aloud to me so I can be making comments, annotations as I listen to the content taking place, and of course ClaroRead as well. So these have all been ways for me to either access content via audiobooks or giving feedback to students in a bit of a streamlined, quicker way. All right, so obviously you have to think about the way that you're modifying input or output for students, so the way that they're producing or sharing their knowledge. And so these are just a couple of quick rapid fire ideas of ways you could do that. So it gets a bit tricky when you think about English as an additional language, but as a broad point, you want to give students as many inputs as possible, and for EAL that includes captions, etc. And you have to remember, the main problem with language is, of course, that it's ephemeral. It's gone with the wind. As soon as you say it, that's it. If you've ever had to, rewind a podcast because someone said something very clever, that's one of the core issues. So we're trying to sort of challenge that in some of our classroom practices. So I don't know if many of you are using this already, but there's a feature already within PowerPoint where you can automatically allow subtitles. So as I was speaking, as I am now, or presenting to a class, it would be actively subtitling beneath the PowerPoint as I speak. So I'm still not fully sold on the use of this, but I've set it up for all of my classes, and it's just become part of my practice. Whether it's a quantum leap or not, I'm not exactly sure. I have had a couple of students say at various points, I didn't hear what you said necessarily, but I was able to, check the subtitle that hung on the screen for a couple more minutes. That to me might have potential for a really good way to make my class a little bit more accessible. And then, of course, if you're teaching via Zoom, as many of us have to, there's a live transcription setting that's very useful. I didn't necessarily know it was there until some of my students set it up for me during remote teaching and lecturing. But similar concept, both work, but in different formats. Immersive Reader is not something I'm super across, but obviously it's a Microsoft product that you can, probably more suited to primary school students, but a different way you can get students engaging with text and make it a little bit more visual and a little bit more, comprehensible, I guess. And then again, if you're, next time you need to show the students how to set up any of these apps or get these programs happening, there's of course there is now a setting on your iPhone where you can record your screen, saves it straight to your camera roll, and then you can upload that to wherever your students can see it, as a simpler little way to work from a space where they're native, and you can show them, the skills that you're expecting them to practice. Flipgrid is a really good way, and this is me, signing for what that's worth, not not a strength of mine, but signing as an alternative way, using Flipgrid video as an alternative way for them to share their knowledge and their assessments to me rather than writing or performing a loud oral presentation to a room of teenagers and peers. Dictating Word, again, something I really need, something I'm continuing to try and work into my practice. Next time I have, a lesson idea, so using Dictate while I'm busy doing something else, is something I need to do a little bit better. Taking pictures of things at the end of every class is something that I started and now is just a part of my practice that I consistently do, that I think is really important. Chuck it up on Teams or whatever learning management system you use. So as a quick recap, we've talked about teaching, we've talked about reconsidering the digital spaces and whether those are really achieving our aims, whether they're accessible and inclusive in the way that they're set out. And we've talked about a whole range of different tools closer towards the end about how that might work. So, and then in closing, just a couple of ideas if you'd like to pursue any of these ideas further. I run an online academic group called EduReading. We chat every month about an academic article. I would love you to be involved if that's something that interests you. We also run a book club, same hashtag. We're on Twitter doing the same sort of thing. And then if you, have a spare $200 lying around, you could look into pre-ordering the forthcoming book that I helped co-edit with Keith Heggett, Empowering Teachers and Democratizing Schooling, Australian Perspectives. And that's me. Thank you for your time.